Hello and welcome to the Feeling Good podcast. I am your host, Fabrice Nye, and joining me here in the Murrieta studios is Dr. David Burns. Hi, David.
Hi, Fabrice.
Dr. David Burns has been a pioneer in the development of cognitive therapy, and he is the creator of the new team therapy. He is the author of Feeling Good, which has sold over 5 million copies in the United States and has been translated into over 20 languages. He is an emeritus adjunct clinical professor of psychiatry at the Stanford University School of Medicine. This is episode 39 of the Feeling Good podcast, and today we're going to kind of piggyback on the last podcast where the listener was writing about some of the messages that come from friends, family, and the society. And that sort of build our underlying beliefs in our blueprint. And those often are right below the surface. And what we're going to talk about in this podcast and the next couple of ones is some uncovering techniques to bring those underlying beliefs to the surface. So today's podcast will be on the individual downward arrow. And then we'll look at other techniques next time. So to start with, what are self-defeating beliefs, and why should our listeners care about them?
If you're looking at the theory of cognitive therapy, team CBT is a little newer than cognitive therapy, but it still contains a lot of the core cognitive therapy elements. And cognitive therapists, there are many kinds of thoughts that create our emotions, but there's different levels of perception. And
you may need to expand on that.
Yeah.
Different kinds of thoughts and the levels of perception.
Yeah. That sounds like too many big words.
I know.
But one are called automatic negative thoughts, or ANTS, A-N-T-S. Mm-hmm. Beck coined the term automatic. These are the thoughts that come into our mind automatically when we're upset and trigger the emotions.
Are there any that don't come automatically?
No, they all come pretty automatically, I'm afraid. So let's say you give a talk to your group at work or church or school, and it doesn't go very well. I had a talk. My first talk I gave in England, and I thought it was going to go terribly, and it went terribly. And then I was very upset afterwards, and I was telling myself I'm a loser. I blew it. Everyone's going to judge me. Everyone's looking down on me.
Yeah.
I should have been better at public speaking, stuff like that. And those thoughts come into our...
Wasn't that true?
Well, they seemed very true at the time. But it turned out they really weren't that true. In fact, they were off by a huge margin, as it turned out, but they sure felt that way.
Yeah.
And those automatic negative thoughts have the distortions we've talked about in previous podcasts. They're
That's right.
Forms of self-deception, all or nothing thinking, black and white thinking. If I'm not a complete success, I'm a total failure.
Yeah. Magnification, overgeneralization, and so on.
Exactly. Yeah. Self-blame, hidden should statements, emotional reasoning. I feel like a loser, so I must be a loser. So a lot of cognitive therapy is focused on powerful techniques to make us aware of these 10 distortions in the negative thoughts, and also how to crush those thoughts, how to replace them with more positive and more realistic thoughts.
Yeah.
And the moment you change the way you think, you can change the way you feel. And that's a very fantastic, positive message. It's been around for 2,500 years. Now, there's another level, though, of thoughts and perceptions. You see, the automatic negative thoughts only come up when, at certain times, and in this case, our self-defeating beliefs, that's our value system, our core beliefs under the surface, and we have those all the time, even when we're not upset. And those core beliefs, or self-defeating beliefs, explain why we get upset when we get upset. A simple example...
Just like the underlying structure of our cognitive system.
Yes, going a little deeper into the brain. What are the deeper beliefs under the surface? And so For example, in the example I gave, I had the achievement belief. My worthwhileness as a human being depends on my achievements.
Yeah.
And also perfectionism. I've got to do tremendous or it's no good at all type of thing. Or you could have the love addiction. My worthwhileness as a human being depends on being loved, and I need love to feel happy and fulfilled. And so if you have that self-defeating belief, then under the surface, then we would predict that when you feel loved and cared about, you'll feel happy.
Right.
Because you'll say, oh, I'm loved, I'm worthwhile, life is great. But we would predict that you would develop intense anxiety and depression at those moments when you're being rejected. When you're alone, when you're not being loved.
Yeah, that's the flip side of it.
Exactly. And so if you could change these self-defeating beliefs under the surface, not only could you feel better in the here and now, but you would be less vulnerable to painful mood swings in the future. Like if you stop basing your worthwhileness as a human being on being loved or achieving all, great things, then when you have a failure, you could view it as an opportunity to learn and grow rather than some mark against your worthwhileness as a human being.
Sure.
Or if someone is angry with you and rejecting you, you could use the 5 secrets of effective communication to find out what they're upset about and to try to develop a deeper relationship with them. Or to realize that you can be happy without that person. But when you're saying, I have to have love, or I need John's love or Mary's love to be happy and worthwhile, then you're going to be very vulnerable always to anxiety and depression. So there's a couple of issues involved. First, how do we find out what our self-defeating beliefs are?
Yeah, because they're, by definition, under the surface.
Exactly.
Hidden,
Exactly. And then the second question is, once we find out what they are, how do we change them so we can feel happier and more productive and closer to people for the rest of our lives?
Right.
And so I've developed 2 uncovering techniques, and then Albert Ellis in New York developed a third, and we're going to go over those 3 in these podcasts. Today is the individual downward arrow, and that's where you find out what your own self-defeating beliefs are. And this might be exciting for listeners because if you play along with us here, we're going to kind of give you some exercises to do while we're listening to this podcast. And
now, I heard a term, and tell me if it's the same thing or if it's different. Something called vertical descent. Is that the same thing?
I haven't heard that term, but that would probably be the same type of thing. We're going to descend deeper into the brain.
Yeah.
But the listeners, you'll be able to use this technique probably to find out today in this podcast what your own self-defeating beliefs are.
Right.
And the individual downward arrow that we'll do today is a really neat technique. I think you're going to love it. And it gets at the individual self-defeating beliefs like perfectionism, the love addiction, the achievement addiction. And these are often self-esteem equations of the format, to be a worthwhile person, I need substance X.
Right. And that's definitely a big subset, and at least one that creates depression and also anxiety.
And substance X is usually achievement, perfection, approval, love.
Yeah, it doesn't have to be an actual substance. It's a particular factor that we believe we need in our lives.
Yeah, and these often are societal messages because, for example, the achievement addiction goes back to the Calvinist work ethic.
We're taught that, yes.
Yeah, that's the basis of Western civilization.
Yeah.
If you do good things, you're a good person.
Yeah.
If you produce, and if you're lazy and don't produce good things, then you're a bad person.
Yeah.
So that's what we'll be up to. In the next podcast, we're going to do another possibly even more phenomenal uncovering technique that I developed called the interpersonal downward arrow, where you can get at another kind of belief, the beliefs that lead to conflict in personal relationships.
Yeah.
And these are often expectations of what will happen in intimate relationships. And I call it the rules and the roles. what role do I think I'm going to be in an intimate relationship or relationship with a colleague? What role will I play? What role will they play? And what are the rules that connect these roles? And the idea behind this interpersonal downward arrow technique is a Buddhist concept that we create our own interpersonal reality at every moment of every day. See, we think people are treating us in a particular way because that's the way they are. But in reality, we're creating them, we're forcing them really to treat us in a particular way. That's the phenomenal thing about this whole interpersonal downward arrow. And another phenomenal thing about it is in our next podcast, when we do it, I'll be showing how you can complete a course of psychoanalysis in 5 to 7 minutes rather than 5 to 7 years. And it's really, really cool. The individual downward arrow is also based on a Buddhist concept that we create our own emotional reality at every minute of every day. In other words, all of our feelings, positive and negative, are created by our thoughts and by our beliefs.
Right. That's what cognitive therapy is based upon, yeah.
Yes, absolutely. And then the third podcast will be the what-if technique that Albert Ellis developed. And that's how, if you struggle with anxiety disorders, phobias, OCD, generalized anxiety, post-traumatic stress disorder, agoraphobia, whatever it happens to be, it will reveal to you the core feared fantasy underneath your anxiety disorders. And in that podcast will also show how you can, once you know what the core fantasy is, how you can overcome that fear.
Yeah, those are the nightmare scenarios that we build in our minds.
Yeah, exactly. So
let's look at the downward arrow, the individual one. Yeah.
Now, when I do a downward arrow technique, and
why is it an arrow, by the way?
Well, I'll explain that.
Okay.
Just a minute. But we're going to go an arrow there. We'll wait just a second until I get the mood log up here. Then
I'm jumping ahead here.
Yeah, I'll talk about the difference between a horizontal arrow and a downward arrow because they're very very different. But I always start out with a daily mood log when I'm doing any kind of uncovering technique because it gives me something specific to work on with the patient.
Starting point.
Yeah. And so I will post this on the notes, the show notes, so that the listeners can link to this.
We'll have that daily mood log up there.
Yeah. And this was a man, a psychologist we'll call Herald, who came to one of my workshops, and then he came to another workshop a year later. Mm-hmm. And at the first workshop, I had emphasized the importance of using the brief mood survey to find out how our patients are feeling at the start and end of every therapy session, how depressed, how suicidal, how angry, how anxious, and how they rate us for empathy and helpfulness at the end of the session. And I emphasized in the workshop that those of you who are attending, your perceptions of your patients are not accurate. You think you know how they're feeling, and you don't. And if you choose, to treat patients without my brief mood survey or other similar tests others have developed, you're like a tightrope walker without a net underneath, and you may be in for some shocks. Well, sadly, this fellow didn't believe that message, and then he came to the workshop the next year and wanted to do some personal work. And it turned out that his favorite patient had committed suicide totally unexpectedly.
Wow.
And he had no idea that the man was suicidal. And then if you look at the daily mood log, and we can see it here, he was feeling depressed and anxious and ashamed and guilty and incompetent and inadequate. All 100% is how he was feeling in the workshop, as intense as a human being can feel. And he also felt humiliated, hopeless, and discouraged, all of those 90%. And then he felt frustrated and defeated 100% and angry 100%.
Yeah.
And this is really the dark side of our profession. There's tremendous joy in being a therapist, particularly if you have techniques you can see someone change and recover and before your very eyes. But the downside, it's just devastating to have a patient commit suicide. It's a horrible loss. The patient unnecessarily loses their life. it destroys the family often, and it can be devastating to the therapist as well. And then what are the what causes Harold's negative feelings?
Well, what causes his negative feelings are negative thoughts.
Exactly. And so how could we find out what his negative thoughts are?
Well, we ask him. So
Yes,
what are you telling yourself as you're thinking about your patient committing suicide?
Exactly. And again, the listeners can click on the link to see that, but he was telling himself, I should have seen this coming. And he believed that 100%. My colleagues will look down on me 100%. I'll get sued 50%. Thought number 4, it's unfair. He should have been more honest with me 100%. And this is my fault 100%.
Yeah.
Now, when you're working with a daily mood log, you can have a horizontal arrow or a downward arrow, vertical arrow.
So what's the horizontal one? Yeah.
It would be like moving from, I should have seen this coming, finding the distortions in it, and then putting a positive thought to challenge it, moving, in other words, from the left negative thought column to the right PT, the positive thought column.
So,
that's a horizontal arrow.
So you're doing that reframing there.
Yes.
And you're still in that particular thought.
Yeah, and the purpose there is to change the way the patient is thinking and feeling.
Yeah.
So horizontal arrows are change techniques.
Okay.
Vertical arrows, you're not trying to change anything. You're trying to reveal the belief system under the surface.
Right. So you're going to the root.
Yes. And so we're going to do a downward arrow, and I'm also, we'll post what we're going to do now, this PowerPoint presentation as a PDF that the listeners can watch while we're doing it. Now,
so it might be good for people to actually listen to this while they're viewing the presentation. Yeah. Or they can do that later if they're listening in their car.
Either way, because if they do it in their car, then
I think we're going to have a lot of accidents.
So now I'm going to be the patient, and you're going to be the shrink.
Okay.
And so I'll be this fellow, what we're calling him Herald. Yeah.
Herald, yeah.
And I have the thought, I should have known he was suicidal. I should have seen this coming. And so then I tell the patient to draw a downward arrow under this. And I also write it and put a downward arrow under it. And I usually put it on a separate piece of paper so we'll have enough space. Yeah. Because you run out of space on the daily mood log because we're going to generate.
You need to have like a scroll or something.
Yeah, exactly. And so the downward arrow is a form of shorthand that means if that were true, what would it mean to you? Why would it be upsetting to you? And so you'll be the shrink and ask me that. And then whatever I say next, say, good, write that down.
Okay. Mm-hmm. All right. So let's practice this.
So I'll
So Harold, you should have known that he was suicidal and you should have seen this coming.
Yeah,
if that were true.
Let's just start over here. Just a second. I'll be Herald.
You'll be Herald, yeah.
And so I'll say that, and then you say this if that were true thing. And then whatever I say good, write that down. Okay.
All right.
So I'm telling myself I should have known he was suicidal. I should have seen this coming.
So Harold, if that were true, what would it mean to you, and why would it be upsetting to you?
Well, that means I failed.
Okay, good. Write that down.
Perfect.
And so if that were true, then what would it mean to you? What would it be upsetting?
Yes, and those who are listening along and watching, you can see we keep putting downward arrows under each thought. Yeah. Well, if I failed, that means I'm a failure and a fraud.
Okay, so write that down. And if that were true, what would it mean to you, and why would it be upsetting to you?
Well, that means I'm no good.
Okay, perfect. Write this down. And now, if that were true, what would it mean to you? Why would that be upsetting to you?
Well, then no one would like me or respect me.
Excellent. So write this down, too. And if that were true, what would it mean to you, and why would it be upsetting to you?
Well, then I'd be worthless and all alone.
Okay, great. So write this down, too. And so if that were true, that you'll be worthless and all alone, what would it mean to you, and why would it be upsetting to you?
Well, I'd be miserable forever if I had to be alone.
Well, great. Write this down.
Right. And now we're kind of at the bottom of the barrel. And then what you do is you go back
And how do you find out that you're at the bottom here?
Well, generally, I'd be miserable forever, or then life is not worth living. That's generally the bottom of the barrel. Yeah. But the therapist might stop before the bottom of the barrel because the therapist might stop at his or her own self-defeating belief. Do you see? Like, let's say you have the thought, the patient has the thought, like Herald did, then I'd be worthless and all alone.
Yeah.
If the therapist is afraid of being alone, the therapist might say, oh, that would suck. That's the bottom of the barrel.
Yeah.
But if the therapist has overcome your own fear of being alone, then you might say, and then what would that mean to you if you were alone? Why would that be upsetting to you?
So you're saying that the therapist is the one to decide when the end of the barrel is.
Yeah, that's right.
So you don't let the client do that.
That's right. And in addition, if you don't go all the way to the bottom of the barrel, it doesn't make that much difference because you'll still come up with many self-defeating beliefs. And also you can repeat this on several occasions with the patient. So it's like drilling down in a gold mine, and you come in from different angles, but you'll always be going to the same veins of gold in the bottom. So once you have your chain of downward arrow thoughts, then I review it again with the patient and say, let's see if we can figure out what your self-defeating beliefs are here. And in fact, I brought a list along that I'm going to post so we can have this as an exercise, both for you and me to do and also for our listeners to do. But we start out and you say, I should have known he was suicidal. Or you would say to him, Harold.
That was the first one, yeah.
Yeah, you're saying you should have known he was suicidal. You should have seen this coming. Therefore, you failed. That means you're a failure and a fraud if you failed. And then that would mean you're no good. Then no one would like you or respect you. Then you'd be worthless and all alone if no one liked you or respected you.
Yeah.
And then you'll be miserable forever.
Yeah.
So now, what are Harold's self-defeating beliefs? And so I would hand Herald this list.
Right.
And I'm posting it of 23 common self-defeating beliefs. And so let's now ask you folks to pause your tape recorder and take a look at that list and see if you can come up with 3, 4, 5, or more of Harold's self-defeating beliefs.
Okay, so I hope that folks had time to do this. So looking at the list of common self-defeating beliefs, do we go through the list and try to match them with the thoughts that Herald came up with?
Something like that, yes. The self-defeating beliefs is the logic that links thoughts that aren't logically connected.
Yeah.
This is the philosophical system that causes us to have all these linked downward arrow thoughts. And so I just say, and I'll say to the listeners, if you want to print this list from your computer, and then you can just circle the numbers of the ones, and hopefully you just did this, that describe Harold's self-defeating beliefs. So why don't you and I go through these and see which ones.
So the first one is perfectionism. I must never fail or make a mistake. So obviously there's a pressure not to fail in Herald. So I think this one is probably present there.
Absolutely, good call. What others do you see?
So perceived perfectionism is the number 2. People will not love and accept me as flawed and vulnerable human being. And if I recall correctly, I think yes, because he said that if he's a failure, then that means he's no good, and that means that people will not like him.
Yes. So he can't fail and be loved and respected. Yeah. So perceived perfectionism is huge,
right.
Huge with him. What else do we see here?
So number 3 is achievement addiction. My worthwhileness depends on my achievements, intelligence, talent, status, income, or looks. That seems to be quite appropriate here too. So
absolutely,
we have the 3 self-defeating beliefs that have to do with achievement very present here.
Yeah. How about the love cluster? Approval addiction, love addiction, fear of rejection.
So I need everyone's approval to be worthwhile. I can see that in here too, because he said I'd be worthless and all alone.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, and the number 5 here, love addiction. I can't feel happy and fulfilled without being loved. If I'm not loved, then life is not worth living. And
yeah, I'd be miserable forever.
I'd be miserable
to be alone. Yeah, without love.
I guess alone also means not without love. So, So I'd say, so far, he's really hitting the hitting the jackpot.
It's like the 10
the grand slam.
Once you find one, you find many more. Yeah.
Number 6 is fear of rejection. If you reject me, it proves that there's something wrong with me. And if I'm alone, I'm bound to feel miserable and worthless. Yeah, that's the very statement that we just looked at. The next cluster is submissiveness. Number 7 is pleasing others. I should always try to please others, even if I make myself miserable in the process. That's not obvious to me in here.
No, you could argue for it, but it doesn't jump out literally. He may have that tendency, but it's not.
Yeah.
It's not. And one thing you have to be careful, just use the downward arrow cluster, not his other negative thoughts.
Right.
Because they had other self-defeating beliefs in them.
Yeah.
But I try to make it pretty disciplined and just stick to the downward arrow. Don't read things into it. One of the things I like about this, it's a pure technique. The therapist doesn't throw trips on the patient. Like, say, from some textbook or some school of therapy you're in, say, oh, this is your problem or that's your problem.
Right.
This is all coming out of the patient's mind.
Yeah, and so what we're doing here, you're actually asking the patient to read through the common self-defeating beliefs.
And they find it real easy to identify them. How about 9?
So 9 is self-blame. The problems in my relationships are bound to be my fault. No, I don't see that.
He's not blaming himself for the death of this patient?
Well, but it doesn't have to do with relationships.
The patient is suicidal. This means I failed.
I failed, yeah. And so the failure for him has to do with being no good.
Yeah, right.
But he does not directly relate it to relationships.
Right. Does the patient have any role and responsibility for his life and taking his own life?
Well, of course, yes.
So you could argue self-blame from that point of view because he's saying, I'm no good if my patient commits suicide. I failed. It's all on me. But if you thought it isn't a pure example of self-blame, that's good too.
I mean, I can see that he's blaming himself in there for sure. But what it says here in the worksheet is that this has to do with the problems in his relationships. So that's a little bit more specific, which I don't think applies here.
Yeah, unless you view that as a problem as a relationship with his patient.
Yeah.
But at any rate, the cool point that's coming up here, if I think it might be something that the patient has come up with, I might say, well, would self-blame fit? And then if the patient says, no, that doesn't fit, you just drop it. You take the ones that resonate for the patient.
Yeah, they need to feel like it really applies to them.
You see any others? We've got 6 so far. How about 23?
23 is Superman. I should always be strong and never be weak. Yes, I definitely see that one. In fact, we can just browse through the list. I don't need to read them individually.
To see if anything else jumps out at you.
Let's see. Maybe the number 14, worthlessness, inferiority. I'm basically worthless, defective, and inferior to others.
Yeah.
I think that applies, even though it's dependent on his failure. It's still there.
Yeah. In fact, you could say he may have a basic self-concept or schema of being kind of inherently worthless. But if I can impress you with my successes, then you'll kind of quasi-love me as long as I can keep it up. But inherently at my core, I don't have any
and
worth.
He's constantly trying to do things to alleviate this, and which is
and then the one other, maybe we could say brush fire fallacy. Like if one person disapproves of me, everyone will. Disapproval will spread like brush fire.
So where do you see him saying that in his downward arrow?
Well, that if one person finds out everyone will disapprove of me, everyone will reject me, and I'll be all alone. So I have to keep this suicide a secret. You see.
Well, I mean, that's your interpretation. I don't know that he would.
You see, no one would like or respect me.
Okay, so I guess the patient would have to see that.
Yeah, he'd have to see it. If he didn't see it, you just drop it. But you could easily argue for that, and that's the thing that makes it terribly, puts him under extreme pressure to, get everyone's approval and present himself in such a way and never let anyone see that he's failing or screwed up. I had a dear colleague who went on a hike recently, someone who I just have a world of respect and admiration for. And I said, why is she coming on the hike today? She doesn't usually come on the hikes. And then she described a teenager who'd been referred to her. And I guess the parent's father thought the teenager was depressed and, needed help. And the girl told her, no, I'm fine. My parents are kind of uptight. I'm doing good. I don't need any therapy. So she discharged her and didn't try to coerce her into a course of psychotherapy, which... well,
you can't really do that.
Exactly. And then the next day she got a call from the father that the daughter was clinging to life in the intensive care unit and was unsure if she would pull through, that she'd gone home and made a suicide attempt.
Yeah.
And I think she did survive. But my reaction was just to feel even closer to my colleague and to just want to give her all the support in the world. Just the opposite of this, Herald's concept.
That's right.
So that's kind of
so are these all the self-defeating beliefs, or
no? This is just a starter kit to kind of give you a feel for how they work, and then like the one that the podcast that we just did, the previous one, her belief, and that people were kind of imposing on her too, was to feel happy and fulfilled, I have to have a baby.
Yeah.
You see, and that's not on this list.
Right.
So when you do a downward arrow technique, you may come up with a belief that you have that
right.
is unique to you.
So now we've done this inventory. What do we do with it?
Well, we'll do that in a future podcast. Like once we have a self-defeating belief, how do you change them? And I'll just mention the techniques now.
So the principle of the downward arrow is to create this inventory.
Yes.
And then you can work with that later.
Yeah, and I'll show you how to do a cost-benefit analysis, the semantic technique, the experimental technique, the feared fantasy. There's a lot of really cool methods we can illustrate in a podcast. But right now, the goal of the listener should be to find out what your own self-defeating beliefs are, and you always want to start with a negative thought that you've had, a distorted negative thought, and then you draw the downward arrow under it. Say, if that were true, what would it mean to me? Why would it be upsetting to me?
Yeah.
And then you repeat that. You repeat that process, and it works. It works pretty easily. I have brought this list to the Stanford Hospital as part of my volunteer work at Stanford. I helped to create a daily inpatient cognitive therapy group for an hour and a half. They need more than that in the hospital. I think psychiatric inpatients should be having 6 or 8 hours a day of group cognitive therapy or team therapy, good psychotherapy. That's my own belief, but they at least let me, create an hour and a half a day for them. And I used to distribute this to the patients, this list of 23 self-defeating beliefs, and they like this almost as much as the list of 10 distortions, because it's something kind of fashionable in finding out that, your problem is you're perfectionistic. Because only the very best of us could be perfectionists. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
In other words, this isn't like a patients, clients, whatever word you want to use, don't take this as a put down, but they find it fun to work with this list of self-defeating beliefs.
Well, and let me ask you one more question, which is, why do you think this works? Like, by the end of Herald's downward arrow, he came up with, I'd be miserable forever if I had to be alone. Why couldn't he have come up with this right off the bat and put it down on his mood journal?
Yeah, he could have. Sometimes just on the daily mood journal or daily mood log, you'll have a negative thought actually is a self-defeating belief.
So what is it that elicits this when you do the downward arrow? What's the mechanism at play here?
It's just to say, what would this mean to you? Why would this be upsetting to you? Suppose you, like in say someone who comes to my Tuesday group, they'll often have a lot of thoughts that make them anxious about doing a role play, because they have the thought, well, if I do a role play, I might screw up, and that's all they're aware of. And so they're all feeling anxious, and what if David calls on me? What if I have to do a role play and screw up? And then when you say, let's write that down. Write down that negative thought. If I do a role play here in group, I might screw up, and then put a downward arrow under that. Yeah. And the downward arrow means, suppose that happened to you. What would it mean to you? Why would it be upsetting to you? You see, when you do a downward arrow, you're buying into the negative thought over and over. When you do a horizontal arrow, you're challenging the negative thought. You're saying maybe this isn't true, that everyone's going to look down on you. But when you do it downward, you say, what would that mean to you? Oh, well, if they see me screw up in a role play, then they'll lose respect for me. They won't like me. Okay, we'll put that down. And then what would that mean to you? So
really, correct me if I'm wrong, but it sounds like it sort of promotes introspection.
Yes. Yeah. And psychoanalysts have been getting at these constructs for a long time. See, the first two cognitive therapists were Albert Ellis and Aaron Beck. And they were both psychoanalysts.
Right.
So they were just looking for tools to help people change once they got these insights from psychoanalysis. And so, although this is called cognitive therapy now, these are really concepts that psychoanalysts have been dealing with, for 100 years.
Yeah, I mean, the field is pretty broad, and I really like your motto, which is tools, not schools of therapy, and I hope we get to do a podcast on that very topic.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Anyway, so the next time we're going to stick with Herald and take another of his thoughts and do the interpersonal downward arrow.
Okay.
And that's a kind of a mind-blowing and really fun thing.
Well, I'm looking forward to this.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for this one, and again, very enlightening podcast.
Yeah, thanks. Hope it was fun for you listeners too.
This has been another episode of the Feeling Good podcast. For more information, visit Dr. Burns' website at feelinggood.com, where you will find the show notes for this podcast under the blog page, and where you can leave your comments and questions. The website has an abundance of resources for therapists as well as non-therapists, including books, workshops, a list of online training groups around the world, and much more. Theme music is Gypsy Jazz in Paris, 1935, composed and performed by Brett Van Donsel. I am your host, Fabrice Nye, and I invite you to join us next time for another episode of the Feeling Good podcast.